Hi, my name is Hannah Antosh, and this is Smallpox Then and Now. This is for Biology 525 Concepts of Medical Microbiology with Dr. LaShonda Waller. So, some of the objectives of this presentation are to discuss the historic significance of smallpox, also known as the variola virus. Discuss its place in history thousands of years ago as well as today, continuing work. Also discuss the medical revolution that happened courtesy of smallpox and also courtesy of Dr. Edward Jenner and his extensive work on inoculation, which led to the rise of vaccines. There's also to discuss smallpox today as well as continuing work. So, moving on into the historic picture of smallpox, our earliest evidence for this virus actually comes from ancient Egypt as well as ancient China. Researchers and archaeologists have found evidence of disease on mummies, including Ramses V. They have found evidence of diseases on him, whether that is the same strain of smallpox that we think of when we think of when we think of our major smallpox events in American history and European history, or whether it was an earlier strain of the virus is unclear, but the evidence of disease was there. We also have written records from ancient China describing people suffering from an affliction that sounds eerily like smallpox, with fever, vomiting, lesions, with a high mortality rate. Now, smallpox is thought to have traveled throughout the continents via trade routes as people were traveling through, Africa and different parts of Asia. It's thought that smallpox hitched a ride essentially on tradesmen as they went to go peddle their wares or as they went to go buy wares from the country and bring it back. It's thought that the smallpox kind of hitched a ride and made its way throughout all of the continents. It has an extremely high mortality rate of about 33%. About 1 in 3 died. Infant mortality was unfortunately far higher and did depend on the location. Research shows that the infant mortality was about 80%. In London, so 80% died, 20% lived, but mortality could go as high as 98% in areas such as Berlin. The disease in and of itself is a highly contagious virus. This virus belongs to the family Poxviridae, genus Orthopoxvirus, and the species Variola virus. Symptoms of smallpox include vomiting, fever, chills, headaches, backaches. Sounds kind of similar to your typical flu, with those distinctive sores that begin to appear after about 1 to 3 days. Smallpox are unique for a couple of reasons. The first being that their genes include all of the information needed to make any protein that they could possibly need, which allows them to begin their life cycle within the cytoplasm of a cell rather than needing to do a full hack of their host cell. Also, animals cannot contract smallpox. It is a human-only disease, so there is no cross-contamination there. This was a huge plus as researchers worked to completely eradicate it, knowing that they only needed to really worry about humans who got it. There was no risk of a pox-infected animal wandering into an area where people were living and spreading it that way. It was very helpful in the eradication of this disease. It tends to be contracted via the nose or via the mouth, hence the name Orthopoxvirus. Again, talking about this is what I mean when I say these hallmark sores. They tend to be far more numerous. I had smallpox. I had chickenpox as a kid. I had 1 or 2, and then that was about it. it tended to be far more serious in this smallpox family. So the lesions on that skin, like I said, they're a very, when we think of smallpox, this is probably the first thing we think of is someone covered in all these boils and cysts, and, this is what we tend to think of. Unfortunately, these cysts, if a patient were to be in the lucky 66% that survived, oftentimes these lesions left the patient disfigured, and often also left them blind, depending on the severity and location of these pox. Because these pox were so deep, they left extensive scarring on the patient. Another unique characteristic of smallpox is that, along with not only creating all the proteins it could ever need, smallpox also creates a protein called gamma-binding interferon. Now, when we get a virus, typically our body's immune system is going to respond via a couple routes. I'm going to focus on one, right? It tends to release a thing called interferon, right? And interferon is a powerful antiviral that our body creates in order to, fight off an attacker. Now, normally this is great. Smallpox, however, has a nasty habit of creating gamma-binding interferon. And so what that does is, as your body's trying to make this interferon to go, it's bound, right? It's not allowed to release it because it's been bound, can't go anywhere. And that doesn't allow the host's body to effectively fight the disease, leading to a far higher mortality rate, as well as quite a severe illness. Now, on the flip side of this awful coin is the idea that researchers are really hopeful that this same gene can be used to create very effective antiviral therapies. And this is a process that we like to call biomimicry, right? Where we use nature as kind of a guide to creating fun things. Anyway, moving on. Smallpox, one of the big historic significances of smallpox, not only was it an incredibly deadly disease that killed millions of people, it also is kind of where we get our very first taste of vaccines. And this is courtesy of a lot of people. This isn't just Dr. Edward Jenner, whose picture's right here. It started with something called variolation. Now, variolation is a medical procedure in which the matter, right, that gross stuff that's in the boils, that matter is taken from one person and it's given to another person. And what that does is it gives the other person kind of a milder case of smallpox, far less deadly. Now, variolation doesn't necessarily have a clear origin. You can see it, historically we can see it being practiced in Africa, India, China, all kinds of places except for Europe, right? It was practiced by tons of countries before making its way into Europe. Now, it made its way into Europe eventually, partly thanks to someone named Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She saw the technique of variolation when she was traveling, I think, with her husband. She had contracted smallpox, but she observed a variolation happening and observed that people who had it done did not die as frequently from smallpox. And so she was the reason that it was introduced into Europe. And then years later, Dr. Edward Jenner found that there was an old maid's tale that if someone got cowpox, they were immune to smallpox. Now, cowpox, like I said, smallpox is a human-only virus. Cowpox is not. Cowpox is very similar. It infects cows, and it can jump from cows to people. Now, they found that when people got a cowpox, which is very mild, they very oftentimes did not get smallpox, and smallpox would sweep through the village. And so Dr. Edward Jenner thought about that and went, how can we use this? And so he took matter from someone who had smallpox. Thought maybe if I take matter from this girl and her cowpox and I give it to this person, maybe it will give them, we can test and see if cowpox gives them an immunity. And it worked. He took matter from a cowpox from a cow maid, that's what they called her, and gave it to a young boy. He got a very mild case of cowpox, and then about a month later, he inoculated that same boy with pus from a smallpox. And lo and behold, this young man did not contract smallpox. Because cowpox is in kind of that same family. It's kind of a weaker form of the virus in a way. And so it gave this boy immunity to smallpox. And so this was like the first real cure that people had, or real preventative measure that people had for evading this incredibly deadly disease. It actually, in a letter to Edward Jenner, Thomas Jefferson wrote, quote, "You have erased from the calendar of human afflictions one of its greatest. Yours is the comfortable reflection that mankind can never forget that you have lived. Future nations will know by history only that the loathsome smallpox existed, and by you has been extirpated." Meaning that we will forever know Dr. Jenner for his contribution, and we will only ever know smallpox as something that is a has-been. Smallpox was officially declared eradicated in 1980. I'll get to that in a minute. The road to eradicating smallpox was a long one. In fact, the World Health Organization had to create a standard protocol for the creation, administration, and storage of that smallpox vaccine, years later after Dr. Edward Jenner had long passed. Because so many people were doing it so many different ways that the WHO finally went and said, okay, here's a standard protocol, here's how we're going to do it. So everyone kind of got on the same page. And it's through this cooperative effort that smallpox was eventually declared eradicated in 1980. There has not been a single case of active smallpox since 1978, according to the CDC. And there's only 2 viruses in the world that officially work with the variola virus. There used to be more, and then they thought, this is a fairly deadly disease. We need to make sure that we know that there's only only a select number of laboratories that can handle this disease, because it does require such a high level of, safety precaution. The first one is at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, housed in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. The second laboratory that is officially able to work with the variola virus is the State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology in Kosovo, Russia. It's Russia. There are future concerns for, and these guys are working with the variola virus to see what else can we glean from it. Can we use it, as I said earlier? Can we use some of its funky genes as a way to create new antivirals? Now, future concerns, there's a couple. The first one being bioterrorism. Now, bioterrorism is not a new concept. In fact, journals from early European settlements, some of their journals were suggestive of giving indigenous populations blankets that had been infected with smallpox. A notable proponent of this was Dr. Jeffrey Amherst. He wrote all about it. Threats were made during the Cold War by the deputy director of the Soviet Union's bioweapons program that large quantities of the variola virus had been synthesized and were ready to go. Now, whether these threats were just threats or whether they were real has never really been sussed out. There's no actual proof that they had synthesized the variola virus. Probably just a show of who's tougher. It was the Cold War. However, after the anthrax scare of 2001 and after 9/11, fears did rise about the possibility of a bioterrorism incident involving smallpox. So they did take certain countermeasures to avoid this situation ever happening, as well as, and recreating the pandemic that was smallpox. These are my sources. Thank you so much. Have a great night.